Hello and welcome to this lecture organized by the 2022 Miami International GuitART Festival. My name is Federico Bonacossa and I'm a guitarist and composer and professor at the Florida International University School of Music. The purpose of this lecture is to introduce the guitar to composers who may be interested in writing for the guitar but don't know where to start. For those who don't play the guitar, the instrument can be quite intimidating, so my hope is to make it seem a bit more approachable. At the same time, I hope to convince you that the guitar has a lot to offer both as a solo instrument and as a member of an ensemble. For the sake of time, I will focus on the classical guitar, though much of what I will be discussing also applies to other types of guitars. Most of my experience as a guitarist is with the classical guitar, so this is really my area of expertise. In any case, let's begin with an overview of some of the different types of guitars you may encounter. Because the guitar is used in a large variety of genres, there are many kinds available. I think it's fair to say that the most common types of guitars you will come across fall under one of these three categories: classical, steel string, acoustic, or electric. Let's go over some of the general characteristics of each of these. The classical guitar is what is most often used by classical players, though it's also used in a lot of popular music. It has nylon strings and it normally does not have a built-in pickup. Most classical guitars have expensive handmade instruments that are relatively loud, and they prefer to play without amplification. There are exceptions to this, of course, for example, when playing with an orchestra, where playing without amplification is really not an option. The steel string guitar is an extremely common instrument in folk and popular music. The main difference between this and the classical guitar is that the strings are made of metal, but there are some substantial differences in the shape, which is more varied than with classical guitars, and the neck shape. It's important to mention this because while most guitarists can play different types of guitars, players usually will specialize in one or two types of instruments, usually because of the style or styles that they play. You cannot assume, for example, that a classical guitarist will be equally fluent and comfortable on an electric or acoustic guitar, as that may not be the case at all. Some players, of course, play lots of different kinds of guitars very well, but in my experience, this is less true of classical players. If you wish to use different types of guitars in a composition, just make sure to ask the player what you're writing for, what they're comfortable with, and perhaps most importantly, what instruments they actually have available to them. Electric guitars offer the most variety in terms of sound, since aside from there being many kinds of makes and models, players use various effects pedals and amplifiers. There are many different kinds of electric guitars, effects, amplifiers, so it's really a universe of its own. One great advantage of using electric guitar over acoustic guitars in an ensemble setting is that you don't have to worry about them being loud enough, since they can be as loud as you want them to be. I should mention that effects can be used in acoustic guitars and classical guitars as well. A common way to implement this is through a software like Max MSP, where you can design effects and then change between them easily. There are, of course, other kinds of guitars, such as lap steel guitar, pedal guitars, resonator guitars, but these are not something you can expect a professional player to own or be able to play, as in some cases they are really completely different instruments from the standard guitar. Guitars with additional strings, usually 7, 8, or even 10, are not uncommon, but if you're planning to write a piece for a guitar with more than 6 strings, you really should check with the player. Guitars with additional strings do feel very different to someone used to a 6-string guitar, so even if you can find one, the player will likely need extra time to get used to it. 12-string guitars have 6 double strings, which create a kind of acoustic chorus effect. They have a beautiful sound, but I always personally found them a bit awkward to play. Microtonal guitars have been around for some time and recently have become somewhat easier to find. I would not say that they're common by any means, but there definitely is a growing interest in them. I personally have adapted guitars to play microtonal music, and I'm quite interested in this world. Aside from buying a microtonal instrument, you can play microtones on a guitar by retuning it, by adding temporary frets, or by completely refretting a regular guitar. Of course, adding temporary frets is relatively easy, but refretting a guitar is obviously a much more radical thing to do. Let's now talk about fingerings. The classical guitar, which is what I'm going to be focusing on, is played using 4 fingers on the left hand and 4 fingers on the right. The standard terminology for these is 1, 2, 3, and 4 for the left hand, and P, I, M, and A for the right. The left hand works very much like in a cello or violin, but the right hand technique is really unique to the instrument. We'll get into this a bit more as we go on. This is the standard tuning of the guitar. Note that the guitar is a transposing instrument because the notes sound an octave lower than written, just like the double bass and the bass flute. Another important thing to know is that unlike other string instruments like the violin and the viola, guitar strings are not indicated using letter names or Roman numerals, but with numbers in a circle. Roman numerals are reserved for fret position indication, most often in bar chords. As we will see, Roman numerals can also be useful when notating natural harmonics to indicate where a node can be found. The range of a classical guitar is from written E3 to B6, sounding of course an octave lower. Some guitars have an additional fret, but this is not universal. Many electric guitars have 24 frets to extend the range to a full 4 octaves. A quick note on sustain. Low notes, particularly open strings, have much more sustain than the notes in the upper register. This said, most notes make other strings vibrate sympathetically and therefore can give the impression that they sustain more than they actually do. The notes E, F sharp, G, G sharp, A, and B are all found as natural harmonics of the open strings. F and A sharp are the least resonant because these pitches produce very little sympathetic vibration. In the upper register, the most resonant notes are E, F sharp, G sharp, A, and B because they all make the low wound strings vibrate sympathetically. What I just mentioned applies specifically to standard guitar tuning. If I tune the low E up to an F, this would make the F more resonant and the G sharp less resonant. Scordatura is the practice for altering the standard tuning. This is a very common technique in guitar playing, especially in folk music. Generally speaking, you can detune any string up a half step higher, though I would not recommend tuning all strings up as this could damage the instrument, and as much as a fourth below or even more. There will be a point beyond which the strings become too loose, and this will depend on the string material and tension. In most alternative tunings, the strings are tuned lower than the standard pitch. It's possible to use a different type of string, for example, 2 low E strings instead of an E and an A. Now in this case, a player would need an instrument specifically set up for this, but most guitarists own more than one instrument anyway, so this is entirely possible. The good news is that guitar strings are inexpensive and changing strings is really pretty easy. The tunings shown here are some of the most common in the classical literature, which for the most part is written for the standard E, A, D, G, B, E tuning. Here's another common tuning usually used to play Renaissance lute music. One very important consideration when using scordatura is readability. This is not an issue for folk musicians since players generally don't read from notation, but it's a serious limitation for notated music. For example, if I tune the 6th string down a half step, all the notes on that string will now sound a half step lower. This means that the player's internal mapping of the instrument needs to be shifted ever so slightly. This is not very hard to do for 1 or 2 strings, but it can be very difficult, though not impossible, when the tuning is radically different. Aside from letting the player sort out where they need to find the notes, one can use some type of tablature. Tablatures have been around for hundreds of years and are very popular among beginning guitarists. A standard tablature consists of a set of lines, 1 per string, and numbers indicating the fret where a note is located. Rhythms can be indicated using normal stems, though this is not always very clear. Some composers create extremely elaborate tablatures using programs like Illustrator or Inkscape. A good example of this would be the guitar music of Aaron Cassidy. Here we have the same music notated using two different tunings. The player can read from the tablature directly and check what they hear against the notation. My personal perspective on tablature is this. I have not learned music from tablature really since I was a teenager, and therefore I'm not really that fast at reading it. I find it much easier to read from standard notation. I suspect a lot of players feel this way, which brings me to the next point. This example shows another option, which is to notate the music as if the tuning used was the standard E, A, D, G, B, E. The player will in this case not need to worry about transposing any pitches and can learn the music much more quickly. There are two things to keep in mind here. One is that what the player sees is not what they hear. This is not a problem for me, but it can be frustrating for others. Secondly, notes on the guitar can often be played on multiple strings. This means that to avoid confusion, one needs to always specify the string location precisely. In the example shown, this is not necessary because there is only one way the chord can be played, using all open strings. Let's now talk about single note playing. As I mentioned, there are often several places where one can play the same note. Where one plays a note does make a difference. The passage shown is played in 3 different ways, all of which sound relatively different. As a composer, you may want to specify where a note should be played, but I would not recommend overdoing this for single note playing, as players like to find their own solutions based on their own personal technique. Where this does become important is when an overlap between notes is desired. This is a nice effect that is very guitaristic. But before we get to that, let's look at some other callers we can use. Here, the same melody is once again played, this time with pizzicato, then sul ponticello, and lastly using a technique I like to call nail pizzicato, in which the nail is used to pluck the strings instead of the flesh as in normal pizzicato. Nail pizzicato has a nice punch to it, I think. Now, here's the same melody once again, but this time the notes are played always on different strings. This makes it possible to create an overlap between many of the notes, a bit like when we press a sustain pedal on a piano. Keep in mind that the notes that are not played on open strings need to be held down in order to ring over, so this is not always possible. This kind of overlapping of notes is really common in guitar playing. In traditional writing, it is usually implied by the context. For example, in this fragment from a study by Fernando Sohr, it is understood that the notes in each measure will overlap with one another. This is easy in this case because the notes are all on different strings, so one just has to put the left hand fingers in place and then pluck each string with the right hand. Staccato can be played easily on the guitar and is done by cutting notes off with either the left or the right hand. Slurs are almost exclusively used to indicate what are colloquially called hammer-ons and pull-offs. This is when you pluck a string with the right hand and then play one or more additional notes with the left hand. Pull-offs and especially hammer-ons can be played very easily and quickly as long as the notes are within reach of the left hand. While you can play several notes in a row this way, anything beyond 3 or 4 will be difficult to hear as one will essentially have to tap and pluck notes with the left hand, which produces a weak though interesting sound. Playing fast scales, particularly for extended passages, can be very challenging for guitarists. This, of course, will vary from player to player, so it's good to check with the specific performer you're writing for. This is not to say this fast single note passages cannot be idiomatic. It really just depends on how something ultimately lays out on the instrument. Arpeggio patterns are very idiomatic to the instrument. Here we are referring to passages in which the left hand shapes a chord and the right hand plucks the strings one at a time. You can see here, for example, that the left hand does not move much at all. A passage like this can be played very fast, rather easily. Here's another passage that is very idiomatic. The left hand changes position only at the beginning of each measure, and the right hand once again does most of the work. Now, here are some very common right hand patterns. These can all be done very quickly and very easily, so it's good to be familiar with them. Note that the thumb can reach lower strings easily. This is because it is naturally separated from the other three fingers we used. The I, M, and A fingers, on the other hand, are almost always kept close together on the same string or adjacent strings. Separating them feels really awkward, and it's good to avoid that. This is a good time to talk about chords. Chords, of course, have a very important role in guitar playing. In fact, many guitarists play nothing but chords to accompany songs. In notated music, chords are always written note by note. Chord charts such as the one shown here are used mostly by beginning guitarists, but are also common in jazz pedagogy. That said, I believe that becoming familiar with chord diagrams and some of the common chord shapes can be very insightful for a composer. All guitarists will be extremely familiar with these shapes, so it's good to take advantage of that. Here's one possible application. Here I'm using a basic C major chord shape and moving it up further on the neck. As I move the chord shape across the fretboard, the open strings, shown in red, remain the same, so the resulting chords are really different from the original. This strategy, very common for example in the music of Villa-Lobos, works with any chord shape that involves open strings. The basic chord shapes shown here all involve some kind of open string, indicated by zeros, so they can produce very interesting and unconventional sounds when moved around with very little effort for the player. Once you have worked out some interesting sonorities, try combining them with various right-hand patterns. This is all going to be very idiomatic and very effective. You do not, of course, need to include open strings in your chords. If you move a shape up the neck and only play stop notes, the chord will simply be transposed, but will otherwise not change. Now, this isn't to say that one should only use common chord shapes. Of course, you can easily come up with your own very idiomatic shapes by using a diagram such as the one shown below. Here I show all the available notes on each fret, starting from open strings and going all the way up to the 12th fret. Generally, a comfortable reach for the left hand is about 4 frets, so almost any shape that involves notes that are close to each other will be doable. Don't forget, of course, that you can always include open strings. You can press 2 or more notes at the same time on the same fret using what we call a bar. The shape here is probably the first bar chords everyone learns. The first finger stops all the notes on the first fret, then fingers 2, 3, and 4 are used to play other notes, which are all within reach. Note that some of the notes will be stopped by the bar, but can't be heard since another higher note is being stopped at the same time. The notes you can actually hear are shown in green, and the notes that are barred but can't be heard are shown in blue. There are literally thousands of possible chord shapes, many of which are variations of basic chord shapes. Just look up common guitar chords on the internet and you'll see many free charts available. Jazz chord charts provide a much greater variety of shapes and sonorities, so these would be a very good reference. Percussive effects are a lot of fun to explore. The common way to notate them is using X note heads. These are very generic, so I do suggest specifying what kind of effect you're actually going for. I like to use small diagrams in the score to show exactly where I want the player to hit the guitar. You can also indicate whether you want the player to use knuckles, nails, or fingertips. The rasgueado is a classic guitar sound and consists of quickly strumming the strings using nails with one or more fingers. This can be done as an isolated event or as a continuous sound by repeatedly strumming the strings using various finger combinations. Lastly, here are a few other common effects. And here's a list of other effects you should explore. I want to end this presentation by talking a bit about harmonics, since this is a topic that seems to cause a lot of confusion. The two basic types of harmonics you can play on the guitar are natural and artificial harmonics. Natural harmonics are those that use an open string as the fundamental and are produced by touching the strings at various nodes. Here we see the first 8 partial of a harmonic series that has the low E string as the fundamental. The numbers above the notes indicate the deviation in sense from the corresponding notes in 12-tone equal temperament. This is a good thing to know because there will be a noticeable difference when they are played close together or simultaneously. Many composers, in fact, use this discrepancy on purpose. In guitar notation, natural harmonics are almost always notated using diamond note heads. In many cases, composers or editors specify the string and location of the node using Roman numerals to indicate the fret where the node can be found. One of the biggest causes of confusion is the fact that diamond note heads are sometimes used to show the sounding pitches and other times to show the location of the node. Here are various methods using for notating harmonics. The first method is the most clear, I think, but the others are perfectly fine as long as they're used in a consistent way. Here are some of the easiest and most common natural harmonics in standard tuning. I've added the string number and a reference fret for each, but keep in mind that some harmonics can be played in multiple places. Artificial harmonics are also very common. The most familiar type to most guitarists will be the octave harmonics, which are played by stopping a note with the left hand and pinching the harmonic 1 octave higher, using the index finger to touch the node and the ring finger to pluck the string. But other types of artificial harmonics are possible. The principle is really the same as with open strings, but since the left hand is busy stopping a note, the right hand will need to do most of the work. In terms of notation, octave harmonics are best notated as sounding pitches. The player will know where to find them, so you don't need to tell them. Other types of artificial harmonics are not as common, so it's a good idea to clarify what you want in the score. One method is to simply indicate sounding pitches, then provide a suggested fingering somewhere in the score, as I have done here. You can also use this notation directly in the score with or without assigning pitches in parentheses. This concludes my presentation. There are, of course, many other topics we could discuss, but I hope that this has given you at least some ideas of how you can approach writing for the guitar.